The Cairngorm Plateau, vast and deceptively serene, rises in the heart of the Scottish Highlands like a frozen ocean suspended above the land, its rolling whiteness giving no hint of the lethal forces that govern it. In winter, the plateau becomes one of the most hostile environments in Britain, a place where weather systems collide without warning, where wind scours the ground so violently that the snow hardens into iron-like slabs, and where visibility can vanish in seconds, transforming familiar ground into an endless void. Despite its beauty, or perhaps because of it, the plateau has long attracted mountaineers, skiers, and outdoor enthusiasts drawn by the challenge and the illusion that Britain's mountains, modest in height compared to the Alps, are somehow forgiving. This belief has proven fatal more than once, and no event shattered it more completely than the tragedy that would later become known as the Cairngorm Plateau Disaster, a disaster not defined by a single instant of catastrophe, but by a slow, grinding convergence of human decision-making, brutal weather, and the unforgiving indifference of the mountain itself. In November 1971, the Cairngorms were already transitioning into their winter state, a time when conditions could change violently from hour to hour. Snow had begun to settle across the plateau, not yet deep enough to alarm experienced climbers, but sufficient to conceal ice, swallow paths, and blur landmarks. The days were short, the light thin and fragile, and darkness arrived early, often accompanied by falling temperatures that plunged far below what most people expected from a British landscape. Against this backdrop, a group of school children and their instructors prepared for what was intended to be a routine and carefully planned expedition. These were not reckless thrill-seekers, nor were they untrained wanderers. They were part of an organized school group, participating in an outdoor education program designed to build resilience, teamwork, and confidence through exposure to challenging environments. Such programs were common in Britain at the time, reflecting a belief that controlled encounters with nature were essential to character building. The Cairngorms, with their broad plateau and established shelters, were considered suitable for such instruction, provided that experienced leaders exercised sound judgment. The leader of the group was a young and ambitious instructor, confident in his abilities and eager to prove himself capable of managing responsibility in severe terrain. He had prior experience in the mountains, had led groups before, and believed that careful planning would mitigate the risks posed by the weather. The group itself consisted of teenagers, most in their mid to late teens, physically fit, enthusiastic, and trusting of their instructors. They had trained together, practiced navigation, and were equipped with winter clothing, tents, and supplies that, on paper, appeared adequate. What they did not possess, however, was any true understanding of the Cairngorm Plateau's capacity for sudden, overwhelming violence, nor could they have grasped how rapidly a sequence of small misjudgments could spiral into an irreversible crisis. As the group ascended toward the plateau, conditions initially appeared manageable. The wind was present but not yet ferocious, the snow light and scattered, and visibility sufficient to navigate by map and compass. Spirits were high, conversation flowed, and the expedition unfolded much like previous outings. Yet beneath this surface normality, subtle warning signs were already present. The barometric pressure was falling, a signal of deteriorating weather. Clouds were thickening, and the wind, though steady, carried an edge of sharpness that hinted at greater force to come. Experienced mountaineers would later note that these signs, taken together, should have prompted a reassessment of the plan. But in the moment, surrounded by students and constrained by schedules and expectations, the instructor pressed on, believing that retreat would represent an unnecessary failure rather than a prudent choice. The Cairngorm Plateau is notorious not for dramatic peaks but for its featureless expanses. Once above a certain elevation, the landscape flattens into a broad, undulating tableland where distances are difficult to judge and direction becomes abstract. In clear weather, navigation relies on careful bearings and pacing. In poor weather, even experienced climbers can become disoriented within minutes. As the group moved deeper onto the plateau, visibility began to degrade. The horizon dissolved into a uniform grey, erasing the distinction between sky and ground. Snow began to fall more steadily, driven sideways by strengthening winds that cut through clothing and stripped heat from exposed skin. Progress slowed as the students leaned into the wind, their faces stinging, their breaths turning ragged in the cold air. At this stage, the plan called for the group to reach a known shelter, a place where they could rest and reassess conditions. The Cairngorms contained several such shelters, small stone structures designed to offer refuge in emergencies. Reaching one would have provided a margin of safety, a chance to wait out the worsening weather or retreat if necessary. However, as the wind intensified, navigation grew increasingly difficult. Compass bearings became harder to maintain as gusts buffeted the group off course. Snow obscured the ground, concealing subtle rises and depressions that could mislead even careful navigation. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously, with minutes feeling like hours as the group struggled forward against the elements. Fatigue began to take hold, particularly among the younger members of the group. Cold seeps into the body not as a sudden shock but as a creeping numbness, dulling sensation, and eroding judgment. Fingers stiffen, making it difficult to adjust clothing or handle equipment. Speech slows, concentration falters, and small tasks require disproportionate effort. The instructor, aware of these risks, urged the group onward, believing that reaching the shelter would solve the immediate problem. Turning back, in his mind, would expose them to the same conditions for longer, with no guarantee of improvement. This belief, tragically, would anchor the group to a course of action that became increasingly untenable as the storm tightened its grip. By the time the group realized that they had overshot their intended route, conditions had deteriorated dramatically. The wind now roared across the plateau with near-hurricane force, flattening the snow into dense sheets that scoured the ground and erased any trace of their passage. Visibility collapsed to a matter of meters, sometimes less, forcing the group to huddle close together to avoid becoming separated. The temperature plunged, driven lower by wind chill that turned exposed skin numb within minutes. It was in this environment that the instructor made the decision to dig snow holes, an emergency measure intended to provide shelter from the wind and preserve body heat through the night. Snow holes, when properly constructed and occupied by trained individuals, can be effective survival shelters. They require skill, time, and energy to build, all of which were in short supply. The group split into smaller teams, each tasked with excavating a shelter in the hard-packed snow. The work was exhausting, requiring sustained physical effort in brutal conditions. As they dug, the students' clothing became damp with sweat, a dangerous development in sub-zero temperatures. Once inside the snow holes, the dampness began to chill them further, undermining the very protection the shelters were meant to provide. Night fell quickly, plunging the plateau into darkness that felt absolute. Outside the snow holes, the storm raged unabated, the wind howling like a living thing, pounding against the frozen landscape. Inside, the students huddled together, sharing what warmth they could, listening to the sound of the wind and the unsettling silence between gusts. Fear crept in, not as panic but as a heavy, oppressive awareness of vulnerability. Some students remained hopeful, trusting that daylight would bring rescue or improvement. Others began to feel the first insidious effects of hypothermia, their thoughts slowing, their awareness fading, their bodies betraying them in ways they did not fully understand. As the night wore on, conditions inside the snow holes worsened. Ventilation became an issue as drifting snow partially blocked air holes, reducing oxygen levels and increasing carbon dioxide. Sleep, when it came at all, was shallow and dangerous, as hypothermia can masquerade as drowsiness, lulling its victims into unconsciousness from which they may never wake. The instructor moved between shelters as best he could, checking on the students, offering reassurance, and attempting to maintain morale. Yet even his efforts were hampered by exhaustion and the relentless cold. The storm showed no sign of relenting, and with each passing hour, the group's chances diminished. Unbeknownst to those on the plateau, concern had already begun to grow below. When the group failed to return as expected, alarms were raised, and rescue teams began to mobilize. The Cairngorms, however, do not yield their secrets easily. Rescue efforts were delayed by the same conditions that trapped the group: ferocious winds, near-zero visibility, and extreme cold that made flying impossible and ground travel hazardous. As the storm continued, the window for effective rescue narrowed, and the plateau remained a sealed world of snow, wind, and darkness, holding the fate of the group in its frozen grasp.